New section. Marx's critique of political economy. I now want to show that Marx's attention to the logic of categories is just as vital to his critique of political economy as it was to his critique of philosophy. I begin with a few examples from his early work on political economy, and then show it in detail in some mature contributions to the critique of political economy. 1 second. New section. Marx's early work in political economy. Toward the end of the unfinished Paris manuscripts, called Alienated Labor, the unfinished Paris manuscript, singular, called Alienated Labor, Marx looks back over the course of his engagement with political economy. Quote, private property is the product, result, and necessary consequence of externalized labor. Externalized labor. The exterior relation of the worker to nature and to himself. ... We have, of course, obtained the concept of externalized labor, parenthesis, externalized life, externalized labor, parenthesis, externalized life, end parenthesis, from political economy as the result of the movement of private property. The movement of private property. But it is evident from the analysis of this concept that, although private property appears to be the ground and reason for externalized labor, is rather a consequence of externalized labor, just as the gods are originally not the cause, but the effect of the aberration of the human mind. End quote. Marx. In these passages, we find rudiments of Marx's mature view that value-producing labor, essence, necessarily appears as something other than itself, namely exchange value, appearance. Moreover, Marx here connects essence logic to religion, as he later does in his critique of Feuerbach. 2 paragraphs later, Marx links his construal of externalized labor to a preliminary but telling criticism of Proudhon. Quote, political economy starts from labor as the inevitable soul of production, yet it attributes nothing to labor and everything to private property. Proudhon has drawn a conclusion from this contradiction that is favorable to labor and against private property. But we can see that this apparent contradiction is the contradiction of alienated labor with alienated labor's self, and that political economies only express the laws of alienated labor. End quote. Marx. What Marx here brings home is the futility of trying to eliminate private property without upending the dualism that pervades externalized labor, just as the young Hegelians failed to rout the Holy Family without revolutionizing the earthly family. Externalized labor necessarily appears as private property. The essence logic operating in this early critique of Proudhon recurs in Marx's critique of Proudhonian time chits in the Grundrisse. Marx's comments on James Mill contain striking glimpses of his mature treatments of the value-price relation, more specifically, the price of production market price relation, and of the value form. Footnote, toward the end of chapter 1, toward the end of the chapter, I consider the relationship between the value-price issue, as it comes up in Capital's 3rd chapter, and the discussion of market value, price of production, and market price in the 3rd volume. End footnote. The passage on the value-price, price of production, market price relation offers a remarkable early example of Marx's essence logic at work in his reception of political economy. Quote, Mill makes the mistake, generally like Ricardo's school, of giving the abstract law without the variation and continuous suspension by which it comes into being. If it is an independent law, for example, that the cost of production ultimately, or rather the periodic and accidental coincidence of supply and demand, determine price, value, It is equally an independent law that this relationship does not hold, and that value, bracket, I take it that, quote, price, end quote, is what Marx actually has in mind here, end bracket, and production cost have no necessary relationship, dot, dot, dot. This actual process, in which this law is only an abstract, accidental, and one-sided factor, becomes something unessential with the modern economists, end quote, Marx. Marx could hardly be more explicit in directing his own dialectical logic against the standard version operative in Ricardian value theory. The law whereby costs of production determine value does not exist independently. It comes into existence only by virtue of the actual oscillation of prices, the, quote, actual process, end quote, which the Ricardians neglect as unessential. Here is the prefiguration of Marx's value form analysis in Capital. Quote, thus on both sides private property appears as representing private property of a different nature. It appears as the equivalent of another natural product, and both sides are interrelated in such a way that each represents the being of the other, and both relate to each other as substitutes for themselves and the other. The being of private property has therefore as such become a substitute and an equivalent. Instead of possessing a direct self-identity, is only a relation with something else. Dot, dot, dot. Its existence as value is different from its immediate existence. It is exterior to its specific being, an externalized aspect of itself. It is only a relative existence of the same. End quote. Marx. Sorry, just a funny thought popped into my head. Marx immediately comments, quote, we must keep for another time a more precise definition of the nature of this value, and also the process by which it turns into a price, end quote. This is a date Marx kept in Capital, but only a few pages later Marx indicates that the end point of this early exploration of the value form lies in money, quote, the complete domination of the alienated thing over man is fully manifested in money. The complete domination of the alienated thing over man is fully manifested in money, end quote. Marx. The essence logic of value that culminates here in money is clearly identified by Marx as involving the domination of those persons who perform value-producing labor by abstract things. Quote, what was the domination of person over person is now the general domination of the thing over the person, of the product over the producer, end quote. Marx. New section. Essence logic at work. Marx's theory of value. Though the thought that Marx simply takes over Ricardo's labor theory of value still has currency, it is a profound misconception. The fact is, Marx overtakes Ricardo's labor theory. Appreciating Marx's distinctive logic of essence enables us to see how. In the following passage, Marx draws our attention to his differences with the Ricardian labor theory of value. Quote, it is one of the fundamental failings of classical political economy that classical political economy was never granted. Jesus Christ, I fucked that up already. Quote, it is one of the fundamental failings of classical political economy that it was never granted to classical political economy to discover from the analysis of the commodity, and especially of the commodity value, the form of value, which precisely makes it exchange value. Even in its best representatives, such as Adam Smith and Ricardo, classical political economy handles the value form as something entirely indifferent or external to the nature of the commodity itself, end quote. Marx. In addressing the value form, Marx's theory moves beyond classical theory's dependence on the traditional model of essence and appearance, which fails to show that essence, value, must appear as money. Another clue toward distinguishing Marx's dialectical theory from the Ricardian one comes at the beginning of the section of Capital's first chapter entitled Value Form or Exchange Value. Quote, Here, however, it is a matter of performing what was once attempted, what was not once attempted by bourgeois economy, namely to establish the genesis of this money form, thus to follow the development of the value expression contained in the value relationship from its simplest, least visible shape up to the blinding money form, where thereby disappearing like the riddle of money. Therewith disappears likewise the riddle of money. End quote. Marx. Marx declares his intention dialectically to bring the category of money within the extended scope of the theory of value. Not only is exchange value the necessary form of value's appearance, money is the necessary end form of exchange value. Marx presents his theory of value in two movements. First, Marx moves from exchange value to value, that is, from appearances to the underlying essence that explains their behavior. Then, in the analysis of the value form, Marx shows why it is necessary that value appear as something other than itself, as exchange value, a thing, money. Bridging the two movements, found in sections 1 and 3 of Capital's first chapter, respectively, is the exposition in section 2 of the double character of the labor that produces commodities. There is nothing particularly dialectical about the first movement. Marx starts out from the ordinary exchange relationship. Quote, "Let us furthermore take two commodities, e.g. wheat and iron. Whatever their ratio of exchange, it is always presentable in an equation in which a given quantum of wheat is set equal to some quantum of iron, e.g. 1/4 of wheat equals x hundredweight of iron. What does this equation purport? That a common element of the same magnitude exists in two different things, in 1/4 of wheat and likewise in x hundredweight of iron. Both are therefore equal to a third thing, which is in and of itself neither the one nor the other. Each of the two, insofar as it is an exchange value, must thus be reducible to this third thing." End quote. Marx. What is this, quote, third thing? This third thing is value, the, quote, mere congelation of undifferentiated human labor, end quote, a, quote, social substance, end quote. Quote, "Now, if one leaves the use values of the commodities out of consideration, the commodities retain only one property, that of being products of labor. However, the product of labor has already changed in our hands. If we abstract from the product of labor's use value, we abstract also from the material components and forms which make that product of labor a use value. The product of labor is no longer a desk or a house or a yarn or any other useful thing. All of its sensuous qualities are extinguished, ... Now let us consider the residue of the products of labor. There is nothing of them remaining other than the same ghostly objectivity, a mere congelation of undifferentiated human labor, that is, the expenditure of human labor power without respect to the form of that human labor power's expenditure, ... As crystals of this, the common social substance, the products of labor are values, commodity values." End quote. Marx. There is a striking non-accidental resemblance between this passage and the one in which Descartes draws his conclusion about the bit-turned blob of wax. Footnote. See the passage already cited. Oh, there's a footnote I missed earlier. Footnote. When Marx writes that prices and production costs have, quote, no necessary relationship, end quote, it might appear that he directly contradicts my claim that there is a necessary connection between the law of value and the oscillations of price. However, I take him to mean that there is no necessity for an individual product with a certain production cost to have a certain price. On the contrary, non-identity of price and the monetary expression of production cost is the rule. End footnote. Back to the text. Descartes and Marx face similar conundrums. How can two objects totally dissimilar in their sensuous qualities, the bit and the blob of wax, be the same? How can two qualitatively dissimilar commodities be identical in terms of value? Descartes resolves his difficulty by appealing to the primary qualities of material substance: non-sensuousness, non-imaginable qualities, cognizable only by the pure understanding. Marx turns to the, quote, ghostly objectivity of that, quote, social substance, value of commensurate commodities. So for Descartes, the residue of the wax, that which remains after we abstract from all the secondary qualities, and that which makes the wax what it is something altogether abstract and intellectual, nothing at all sensuous or intuitive. Likewise, for Marx, the way in which two commodities are identical, namely value, is something utterly abstract, the product of an actual social process of abstraction, and contains not a whit of concrete use value or useful labor. The first movement captures the non-dialectical thinking about essence and appearance to which Ricardian value theory is confined. Not so for the second movement, which answers the question never raised in Ricardian theory: why does value appear in the form of exchange value? Marx prepares his answer to this question by digging deeper into the nature of the labor whose, quote, congelation, end quote, is value. The crux of this preparation lies in recognizing that value and value-producing labor are abstractions, quote, beings of reflection, end quote, rather than anything immediate, natural, or sensuous. I'm going to repeat that sentence because it's important. The crux of this preparation lies in recognizing that value and value-producing labor are abstractions, quote, beings of reflection, end quote, rather than anything immediate, natural, or sensuous. Just as the commodity has a double character, use value and exchange value, the labor that produces commodities is double. Quote, tailoring and weaving are constituent elements of the use values, coat and linen. Precisely through their different qualities, they are substance of coat value and linen value, only so insofar as one abstracts from their specific quality, and both possess equal quality, the quality of human labor. I'm going to repeat that because there's italics all over it. Tailoring and weaving are constituent elements of the use values, coat and linen, precisely through coat and linen's different qualities. Coat and linen are substance of coat value and linen value. Tailoring and weaving are substance of coat value and linen value only insofar as one abstracts from their specific quality, and both tailoring and weaving possess equal quality, the quality of human labor, end quote. Marx. Already in section 1, Marx had investigated the nature of this abstract, quote, human labor. The labor that congeals as value is abstract labor in the, quote, physiological sense that it is the expenditure of human labor power without regard to any definite end. But for an hour's labor to count as an hour's worth of value, it must meet several conditions. 1, it must be an hour of, quote, simple average labor, end quote. Hours of complex labor count for more, and what counts as simple average labor is historically variable, not naturally determined. 2, to be, quote, socially necessary, the hour of labor must produce the number of commodities equal to the number produced in an hour, averaged across all producers of that commodity. An hour's labor that produces more commodities than the average counts as more value, and conversely. 3, an hour of labor that is socially necessary in sense 2 is socially necessary in a further sense, one that builds demand into the very concept of value. It's very important. One that builds demand into the very concept of value. only if the demand for that type of commodity matches the supply. If the supply of a commodity exceeds demand, and hours labor on that commodity that is socially necessary in sense 2 produces less than an hour's value, and conversely. This third consideration, involving as it does a co-constitutive relationship between value and price, is a deeply non-Ricardian element of Marx's value theory. Footnote. Paul Maddock Jr. writes, quote, abstract labor, end quote, in Marx's sense is undefined except in relation to a system of prices, end quote. In a similar vein, Guglielmo Carcetti writes, quote, prices are not determined by values, but rather are their concrete form of existence, end quote. Carcetti. End footnote. Footnote, as Carcetti writes, quote, the basic difference between the Marxian and the Neo-Ricardian notion of value is that for the Neo-Ricardian notion of value, value is embodied labor and is determined by the technical relations of production, independent of demand, end quote. End footnote. According to Ricardo's theory, prices are to be the variable completely dependent on labor inputs, construed in a technical sense. Construed in a technical sense. There is no room in Ricardian theory for a dialectic of value and price. What these three considerations mean is that Marx's theory of value cannot be construed as a labor theory in any ordinary or naturalistic sense. Sorry, that wasn't italicized, that's my repetition. The labor that goes into the production of any particular commodity, the, quote, labor embodied, end quote, does not determine the value of that commodity for the three reasons just specified. Footnote, that Marx is not a, quote, labor embodied, that Marx's is not a, quote, labor embodied, end quote, theory is made plain in his polemics against Proudhon and the quote, time chitters. This is discussed below. End footnote. Footnote. Gerrit Reuten, who distinguishes essence appearance models along the lines I do between the, quote, ontological and the, quote, conceptual dialectical, worries that some, quote, abstract labor theorists, end quote, may still subscribe to a, quote, labor embodied theory. This can happen if one thinks that value-producing labor is, quote, abstract labor, end quote, in the, quote, physiological sense, end quote, of which Marx writes, quote, all labor is an expenditure of human labor power in the physiological sense, end quote. And right here is the importance of Heinrich. Heinrich, I don't think Patrick Murray subscribes to this view, but Heinrich thinks that there's sufficient ambiguities within Marx's conception of value that call for pretty severe criticism. And it's lines like the one that was just said, all labor is an expenditure of human labor power in the physiological sense. There is, for Heinrich, there's notes of that in just the basic, in a lot of the writings that Marx writes on political economy, on value, which is also contradicted by other things where he refers to it as a purely social substance. And there's just this ambiguity between these two senses of the concept of abstract labor, and what people who build upon Marx and who engage with Marx need to do is embrace this, the former point of the purely social component as opposed to the physiological understanding of abstract labor. And I don't think Patrick Murray thinks that's necessary. I think Patrick Murray thinks that all the keys for the a social understanding of value is sufficiently fleshed out in Marx's text, and all that needs like proper interpretation. Still in the footnote. If one characterizes value-producing labor, setting aside the three considerations examined above, one could end up with an abstract labor-embodied theory that sticks to the standard or ontological essence-appearance model and falls not far from the Ricardian tree. As Paul Maddock Jr. observes, even the neo-Ricardian advocate, Neo Steedman, insists that it is, quote, abstract labor embodied, end quote, that neo-Ricardian sums in calculating labor value. That neo-Ricardians sum in calculating labor values. See Paul Maddock Jr., 1981. Thinking through the consequences of the three features of value-producing labor just considered forces upon us the dialectical model of essence-appearance, and therewith the abandonment of labor-embodied thinking. End footnote. Value is not a concept appropriate for all human labor, as in naturalistic theory. Value applies only when conditions 1 through 3 above are in force, that is, in competitive market societies where all goods are produced as commodities. Value is Marx's term for the specific, puzzling, and self-obscuring form that social labor takes under capitalism. He could hardly be more explicit than in this passage from A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. Quote, since the exchange value of commodities is indeed nothing but a mutual relation between various kinds of labor of individuals regarded as equal and universal labor, i.e. nothing but a material expression of a specific social form of labor, it is a tautology to say that labor is the only source of exchange value, and accordingly of wealth insofar as this consists of exchange value, end quote. Marx. Footnote. 2 pages later, Marx writes simply, quote, the labor which posits exchange value is a specific social form of labor. The labor which posits exchange value is a specific social form of labor, end quote. And you notice as before the distinction between that, quote, labor which posits exchange value is a specific social form of labor, and the other quote that we saw earlier from Marx that says, quote, all labor is an expenditure of human labor power in the physiological sense. Back to the text. End footnote. As an account of the specific social form of labor under capitalism, Marx's theory of value is definitely cut from different cloth than the classical labor theory culminating in Ricardo. Marx describes his characterization of the double character of commodity-producing labor as, quote, the linchpin, bracket, springpunkt, end bracket, to the understanding of political economy, end quote. Marx's recognition that value and value-producing labor are abstractions that depend on the actual process of abstracting that transpires in capitalist production and distribution, not anything naturally sensuously occurring, parallels Hegel's claim that Descartes' secondary and primary qualities are not logically similar. The secondary qualities are immediate, Descartes' primary qualities reflective. Hegel teaches us that matter is not some substance underlying appearances that just happens not to be observable. Rather, matter is no thing at all on the model of sensuous things. Matter is a being of reflection, an essence in the dialectical sense. That is the kind of being that must appear as something other than itself. Marx's counterpoint to Ricardian value theory runs along just these lines. Value-producing labor differs logically from concrete labor. Value-producing labor differs logically from concrete labor. That's in italics. Just a side note from myself, there's a very interesting talk about capital. I think it was put on by Socialist Workers' Party UK, and it was like a talk about Alex Kalinikos' book, Deciphering Capital, which I have not read. But basically what Kalinikos does, not Kalinikos, sorry, but Chris Arthur's on the panel. Sorry, I was spaced out for a second. Chris Arthur's on the panel, and Chris Arthur talks about, and this is why the notion of practical abstraction is unique, is that there's a distinction to make, because like abstract labor, like if you're just using just like language and stuff, saying like labor considered abstractly, right? Say like the cat, that's an abstraction that isn't really premised on exchange. It's kind of there's the the world of like empirical cats. You can have this concept of cat, right? And that's kind of like a concrete abstraction, which is like a kind of like is referring to just like a kind of like generality in the world. So like human labor, right? You can speak of human labor in terms of like this kind of like generalized thing of like human metabolism with nature, which is kind of like a trans-historical fact of life, even but abstract labor is not of that type. Abstract labor is a practical abstraction that is achieved solely through exchange, and it's abstract in the sense that there's like a concrete practical reduction of heterogeneous labor activities mediated through exchange. So there's a way which you could say, like, there's definitely a degree it's appropriate to say, like, that whole like human physiological that physiological sense of abstract labor, it's not meaningless in terms of like just general vernacular. Like you could say like the abstraction labor, or you could think of like the abstraction of dancing, right? You're always doing a particular kind of dance or something like that, and you can reduce it abstractly, say dancing is such, or something like that. That's not inappropriate in like, but when you're trying to talk about, when Marx says that what economists have always failed to do is to, and this is his big contribution to the discussion of economic ideas, is this idea of abstract labor. If he's saying that everyone else is, if he's the first person to ever thought of that concept of considering labor just in general, he's full of shit, right? And Michael Heinrich says that he's a great. If that's true, Marx is a great pretender. But what he's talking about when he's talking about abstract labor is not fundamentally about just like labor pure and simple. Conceptually understood in all its in abstraction from all its heterogeneous forms. That's not the type of abstraction that's going on here, and that's why the concept of Rätel's real abstraction, which despite whatever limitations Rätel might have, it's a very, very practical shorthand used to talk about the type of the specific kind of abstraction that we're considering here when talking about the type of social synthesis that transpires in a society whose socially divided labor is mediated by commodity exchange. Anyway, back to the text. I'm going to read that last line that I read. Marx's counterpoint to Ricardian value theory runs along just these lines. Value-producing labor differs logically from concrete labor. Even right there, sorry, I'm just going to keep riffing on that, just I'm feeling myself right now. Concrete labor is an abstraction, right? Like, to say that concrete labor, if concrete labor itself is an abstraction, and if abstract labor is just another way of pointing to the same thing that concrete labor, minus like diversity or something like that, then it kind of like renders the distinction between concrete and abstract labor or value-producing labor fundamentally meaningless. Like, concrete labor is an abstract concept, and it's it's appropriate to use the concept of abstract labor. It's not an illegitimate thing to say, just as like labor in the physiological sense is not an in my opinion, an irrelevant thing to say, even though some people might disagree. I think value critics, maybe Moish Bastone, would disagree with the notion of like the abstraction of labor in general. But I don't particularly find that kind of attitude convincing to this subject. But where the hell was I with that thought? Concrete labor is an the concept of concrete labor is an abstraction. If abstract labor and concrete labor are both abstractions, that means that what is being discussed when abstract labor is being discussed is unique. Anyway, concrete labor is immediate, sensuous, particular. Value-producing labor is reflective, abstract, universal. Because it is an abstraction, a being of reflection, value cannot appear immediately. Value must appear as something other than itself. Footnote. Chris Arthur likewise connects Marx's theory of the value form to his rejection of the standard essence appearance model. Quote, if the necessity of a material form of appearance of value is not recognized, then value theory becomes nothing but metaphysical essentialism. End quote. Yeah, I think I'm feeling chatty. Michael Heinrich uses this concept of like how material form, and when he's talking about value form, talks about how like value must be caught by a material form. It's captured in a thing, right? So like the value, if you have put two commodities in an equation with each other, the value of commodity A can only be expressed in a certain quantity of commodity B, and can't be expressed directly. It has to have has that necessary form of appearance as being manifested in a commodity other than itself, right? And Heinrich uses this concept of catching. I don't know where he says it, but he used the word catching, and I thought that was a very apt verb choice to use. And I think this corroborates what Arthur says here, quote, if the necessity of a material form of appearance of value is not recognized, then value theory becomes nothing but metaphysical essentialism. And I think that's true, and sometimes the value form analysis kind of thing can be a little bit confusing, but that's kind of like the crux of just like the whole reason that value form analysis is a thing, because it means, at the core of it means that the necessarily monetary nature of a capitalist economy, value is not something that can be an operative in an economy without the presence of money, right, and exchange. Value is a very it must be manifested, it must be captured in a concrete thing, and the way that this social process of value is captured in a concrete thing makes that relationship, that social relationship, more or less invisible, right? Because when value is captured in a thing, you can have this idea that if it's captured in this thing, then this social relationship, which is not acknowledged as a social relationship, is really just a natural factor of this thing as such, right? And that is what commodity fetishism is. So value form theory is kind of, I think, in my opinion, grasping the insights of it is necessary to even begin to entertain what the meaning of commodity fetishism is, and especially like the depth of it. Right? You could have the superficial sayings like, "Oh yeah, well, not all wealth is necessarily a commodity." Yeah, that's absolutely true, and I 100% agree with that. But the particular way to grasp the particular depth of this issue and why commodity fetishism is not just an ideological illusion, but rather something like much more deeper, something much more like people all have to like practically adhere to, whether how much they rise above it consciously. The depth of fetishism, you need value form analysis. Anyway, back to the text. Money proves to be the necessary form of value's appearance and to be necessary for value's existence. Yet money is not value. Indeed, there is no physically existing fixed measure of value, and there cannot be one. All right, and you can think of that in like inflation, right? I mean, that's the immediate thing that comes to mind with me is like, yeah, money is not constantly worth the same thing. Footnote. As Jeff Pilling puts it, quote, all those who think there can be some supreme invariable measure of value, in fact, completely misunderstand the nature of capital, end quote. Jeff Pilling. Pilling places Ricardians among those who do, quote, it is no accident that there is no trace of the notion of fetishism in the work of what might be called the, quote, Safra school, end quote, which has returned to Ricardo for some answers to the current crisis in economic theory. For it is precisely this school which has grappled with what we have tried to show is a quite mistaken problem, namely the search for some abstract standard of value, be it, quote, a standard or, quote, composite commodity, end quote. Jeff Pilling. Dude, I'm so fucking smart, because he's basically just said exactly what I said. Like, you can't, it's no coincidence. When he says no coincidence that the Safra school, which accepts a labor embodied theory of value, has nothing to say about fetishism, because it doesn't understand fundamentally how value is captured in material things. Anyway, end footnote. Marx says of the turn from the first movement to the second in his exposition of value theory, quote, the progress of the investigation will lead us back to exchange value as the necessary mode of expression or form of appearance of value, end quote. Here we have an incontrovertible assertion of necessity on Marx's part. It is one of many. Footnote. See, for example, the footnote in Chapter 3 of Capital. Later in that chapter, Marx writes, quote, the price form entails the exchangeability of the commodity against money, as well as the necessity of this exchange. Veräußerung, end quote. Marx. Claims of such necessity may be found in many passages from Marx already cited in this chapter. End footnote. The necessity involved here is neither the tautology of deduction nor causal necessity. Dialectical claims are of this non-tautological, non-causal sort. Footnote. Tony Smith is right to insist that, quote, Marx's theory, like Hegel's, includes claims of systematic necessity, end quote. Tony Smith. What justification does Marx offer for his particular assertion of necessity? The answer lies in Section 3 on the value form. There, Marx reveals exactly how the exploration of the double character of commodity-producing labor prepares the way for the presentation of the value form. Quote, not an atom of matter enters into the objectivity of commodities as values. In this, it is the direct opposite of the coarsely sensuous objectivity of commodities as physical objects. We may twist and turn a single commodity as we wish. It remains impossible to grasp a single commodity as a thing possessing value. However, let us remember that commodities possess an objective character as values, only insofar as they are all expressions of an identical social substance, human labor. That their objective character as values is therefore purely social. From this it follows self-evidently, bracket, so versteht sich auch von selbst, that it can only appear in the social relation between commodity and commodity, end quote. Marx. And this is in italics. Once we recognize what value is, namely an abstract, reflective, quote, social, end quote, objectivity, it is evident that value can have no immediate appearance. Once we recognize what value is, namely an abstract, reflective, quote, social objectivity, it is evident that it can have no immediate appearance. The necessity here lies, as in Hegel's criticism of Descartes, in recognizing the different logics of immediacy and reflection. Marx begins the analysis of the value form with its simplest form. X commodity A values at Y commodity B, unquote. The seminal feature of this value expression is its polarity. Commodity A expresses its value in commodity B. A is active and B is passive. Sorry, I spaced out for a second. The necessity here lies as in Hegel's criticism of Descartes in recognizing the different logics of immediacy and reflection. Marx begins the analysis of the value form with its simplest form. X commodity A values at Y commodity B, end quote. The seminal feature of this value expression is this value expression's polarity. Commodity A expresses commodity A's value in commodity B. Commodity A is active and commodity B is passive. Commodity B is the mirror in which commodity A first recognizes itself as a value. The value of A cannot appear in A itself. It can only be expressed relative to A in another commodity. Footnote: Samuel Bailey, with whose critique of Ricardian theory Marx was in certain respects impressed, observed this necessary polarity in the expression of value. Quote, "It is impossible to determine or to express the value of a commodity except by a quantity of some other commodity," end quote. Bailey is quoted in Bachhaus, 1980. End footnote. Quote, "I cannot express, e.g., the value of linen in linen. 20 yards of linen equals 20 yards of linen is no expression of value. The equation says much more reversed. 20 yards of linen are nothing other than 20 yards of linen, a specific quantum of the useful object linen. The value of linen can only be expressed relatively, i.e., in other commodities." That's not italicized, I'm going to repeat it. The value of linen can then only be expressed relatively, i.e., in other commodities, end quote. Marx. Hence, Marx speaks of commodity A as in the relative value form. Commodity B, in which the value of A is mirrored, is in the equivalent form. Accordingly, these two, as necessarily polar, is crucial in analyzing the value form. The value form is a social magnet. Relative value form and equivalent form are extremes that belong to one another, yet shut the other out. To say that the expression of value is necessarily polar means that the expression of value requires a reflective relationship. Marx's repeated use of, quote, mirror, or, quote, value mirror, to characterize the commodity in the equivalent form highlights this feature. The polarity of the value form signals the essence logic. As the essence of exchange values, value must appear in something other than value's self. To appreciate fully Marx's account of the value form, we must be mindful that essence involves alienation. Essence appears only by giving essence's self over to something that is not itself, through alienation. Value recognizes value's self only in value's reflection in another object. The labor that produces value is alienated labor. Fitting the pattern of alienation, the logic of value is inherently religious, in Marx's critical sense. In discussing the relative value form, Marx refers explicitly to his critique of Feuerbach. Quote, "It's, that of the linen, which is in the relative value form, existence as value, appears in its equality with the coat, as the sheep nature of the Christian, bracket does, end bracket, in his equality with the Lamb of God, end quote. End quote, Marx. The Christian achieves fullness only mirrored in the Lamb of God. The nature of the Christian thereby reveals, but the nature of the Christian thereby revealed is that of a sheep. The Christian achieves fullness only mirrored in the Lamb of God, but the nature of the Christian thereby revealed is that of a sheep. For Marx, the religious alienation of the Christian is the necessary expression of the Christian's sheepish nature. Likewise, the fact that a commodity expresses its value only through another commodity manifests the alienation of the labor that produced it. In this context, we should emphasize the, quote, must in Hegel's statement, quote, the essence must appear, end quote. Essence is constrained to appear, because essence harbors within essence's self an unreconciled contradiction between immediacy and reflection. The practical point is this: change must be effected by recognizing and resolving the contradiction immanent to the essence. In the Grundrisse, Marx contraposes the essence logic of value production to the quite different logic of communist production. Quote, on the foundation of exchange value, labor is first posited as universal through exchange. It means it has to be validated through sale. On this foundation, bracket communist society, end bracket, labor would be posited as such before exchange, i.e., the exchange of products would not at all be the medium through which the participation of the individual in the general production would be mediated. Mediation must, of course, take place. In the first case, which starts out from the independent production of the individual, no matter how much these independent productions determine and modify each other post festum, through their interrelations, mediation takes place through the exchange of commodities, exchange value, money, all of which are expressions of one and the same relationship. In the second case, the presupposition is itself mediated, i.e., communal production. The communality as a foundation of production is presupposed. The labor of the individual is from the very beginning posited as social labor. The product does not first have to be converted into a particular form in order to receive a universal character for the individual, end quote. Marx. In production governed by value, the particular is mediated by the universal, but only after it has been produced privately. The two determinations fall asunder. Did I say end quote? Sorry, I'm spacing out. In production governed by value, the particular is mediated by the universal, but only after it has been produced privately, right? That means the particular heterogeneous labor is only validated as universal, as social labor via the process of the sale of the commodity that particular labor produced. And in our case, that particular labor is under the control of the capitalist, not directly, as in this case, of some kind of mythic notion of simple commodity exchange. The two determinations fall asunder and must be wrenched together by the price system. Mediation takes place in communist production as well, but the, quote, middleman, end quote, is avoided by the fact that the particular and the universal determinations coincide. Particularly, use values produced communally are already universals inasmuch as they are decided upon by a society as a whole. There is no further need to impose at the level of exchange a social determination on communally produced use values. Footnote. See also Marx's first footnote in Chapter 3 of Capital, in which he favorably contrasts Owen to Proudhon. This is just a side note for me. In terms of like, I feel like I mean, I don't really know how to like ground this necessarily, because I'm not like a legal theorist of any kind or have as much knowledge of legal theory, but I feel like ingrained within this conception of Marx's idea of communism as like the automatically pre-validated, the pre-validation of social labor without the medium of exchange posits within it a guaranteed right to subsistence, right? Um, um, there's a kind of entitlement that one has to society's collective wealth from the sheer fact of being a human being um, in this in the communist idea, right? So what type of community enforces that right? It is certainly not a society of a naturally evolving society that doesn't have some kind of collective social management over it. It hasn't. Communism has entitlements steeped into it, and whether you want to call those, I don't know, maybe entitlements, social entitlements, and rights aren't the same thing, because certainly societies without states have social entitlements as well, and standards of how people should be treated without the formal existence of like law, perhaps. But there's definitely some kind of rights-like thing embedded in capitalism, which a lot of people, the communist vision, which I think a lot of people hate, because that would, never mind, I don't really know what I was going to say after that, but anyway.
New section, Value and Price in Capital. It is sometimes assumed that in the first volume of Capital, Marx simply identifies values with prices, and that divergences between value and price turn up first with the third volume's discussion of prices of production. But in the first volume of Capital, as well as in related treatments in the Grundrisse, Marx insisted on the necessary non-identity of value and price, a claim Marx explicates in terms of his dialectical logic of essence. Before delving into the theory of price presented in Volume 1, its relationship to the discussion of market value, prices of production, and market prices in Volume 3 should be aired. Bumbaverk's famous critique that Marx's theories of value and price in the first volume were contradicted by the third displays several misconceptions. If you're curious about Bumbaverk's critique, it's Karl Marx and the Close of His System. That whole book's available on this channel. One is that the theories of value and price developed in the first volume are intended to apply to just any commodity. When Marx theorizes about commodities and capital in the first volume, he assumes that an individual capital is an adequate part of the aggregate capital, and that an individual commodity is the product of such an average capital. When these qualifications are kept in mind, we realize that Marx did not forget to bring in market value and prices of production in Volume 1. They do not belong there. 1 second. Sorry. They do not belong there. That's in italics. They do not belong there. Notice that even though the category of price of production, which generally deviates from those of individual and market value, can have no place in Volume 1, a discrepancy between value and price remains. Why? The non-identity of value and price in the chapter on money picks up the discrepancy not between values and production prices under the assumptions of Volume 1, that cannot enter in, but between production prices and market prices in the third volume. Despite its name, production price is not a price at all prices are the money expression of value. Whereas production price, like market value, is a value category. As such, production price must appear as something other than production price itself, namely market price. This is a necessity that is registered in the first volume's theory of price. Marx's theory of price in the first volume insists that the difference between value and price is not nominal. Footnote. As Weeks writes, quote, "For Marx, the essence of the value-price relationship is their non-equivalence," end quote. Weeks. End footnote. To call the distinction between value and price nominal is to obliterate or leave unexplained the differences between these two forms, value and price. Marx's theory of price explains the discrepancies by carefully examining the logic of the forms themselves. We have seen the first and decisive phase of Marx's anti-nominalist theory of price in his theory of value, which shows the logical necessity for value to express itself in money. Since the value of a commodity is expressed through an alien independent object, money, value and price are not and cannot be immediately identical. Their identity arises only in the gravitational pull that value exercises over the oscillations of price. The nominalist theory of price concentrates only on the identity of price and value. The nominalist theory of price disregards the fact that the reflective identity of price and value in the law of price operates only on the unavoidable presupposition of the immediate non-identity of price and value. Marx's theory, on the other hand, recognizes both as equally essential. In terms of Hegel's logic of essence, we can say that both the oscillation of price and the law of that oscillation are on the logical level of essence, and that the proper comprehension of essence recognizes the necessary unity of the two. Hegel writes in the section of his Science of Logic entitled Law of Appearance, quote, "The law is therefore not on the other side of appearance, but rather immediately present in appearance. The realm of law is the stable, reflected image of the existing or appearing world, but even more so are both one totality, and the existing world is itself the realm of laws, which, as the simply identical, likewise is identical with itself in positiveness or in the self-dissolving autonomy of existence," end quote. Hegel. If we substitute, quote, "law of price" for Hegel's, quote, "law of appearance," quote, "the actual oscillation of price," end quote, for Hegel's, quote, "existing or appearing world," end quote, and, quote, "the constant negation of ... itself, bracket price, end bracket, as the negation of real value," end quote. For Hegel's, quote, "the self-dissolving autonomy of existence," end quote, we have the basics of Marx's critical theory of price. Hegel's emphasis on the immanence of the law of appearance to the appearances themselves carries over into Marx's theory of price. Like his critical theory of value and the value form, Marx's theory of price does not hypostatize value. As the law of price, value is not something beyond or outside the actual movement of price. Rather, value is the tethering of price. As the law of price, this isn't in italics, but I want to repeat it again because it seems important. As the law of price, value is not something beyond or outside of the actual movement of price, but rather it is the tethering of price. Value does not exist as an actual observable thing. But as the reflection of actual things. So Marx's theory of price reconfirms the non-metaphysical character of the theory of value Marx puts forth in the first chapter of Capital, just as it underlines his debt to Hegel's logic. Marx reminds us in the third chapter of Volume 1 of Capital not only that the distinction between price and value is a logical necessity, but also that it indicates the social relations within a society characterized by these categories. Quote, the possibility of quantitative incongruence between price and value magnitudes, or the deviation of the price from the value magnitude, lies therefore in the price form itself. It is no defect of this form, it being the possibility of quantitative incongruence between price and value magnitudes, is no defect of the price form, but rather quite the opposite. That makes the price form the adequate form of a mode of production in which the rule can push itself through only as the blindly operating law of averages of irregularity, end quote, Marx. The divergence of price and value is not a surd, as in the nominalist theory. Rather, it is identified as the necessary consequence of the commodity mode of production. By attending to the moment of non-identity of price and value, rather than abstractly fixating on their reflexive identity in the law of price, Marx discloses the price form as a determinate and crisis-laden category of capitalist production. To disregard prices, then, is, quote, mere appearances, or to set prices aside on the grounds that, after all, prices are something other than the essence, is the wrong consequence to draw from Marx's invocation of an essence-appearance model to conceive of the relation between value and price. The model of essence and appearance that Marx employs is dialectical. Appearances are necessary to the essence. There can be no value without price. Since Proudhonism was such a powerful force within European socialism, Marx was particularly pleased with the polemical points his theory of price scored. Writing to Engels on the 22nd of July, 1859, Marx lists as the first outcome of a contribution to the critique of political economy, quote, that Proudhonism is eradicated, end quote. Moreover, the body of the Grundrisse begins with an extensive critique of Alfred Dallemann, a follower of Proudhon, who wanted to supplant money with time chits used on the basis of how many hours an individual actually worked. I want to read the Wikipedia for Alfred Dallemann because he comes up all the time. Alfred Dallemann lived between 1819 and 1902. Alfred Dallemann was born in Lille in December 1817 and not 1819 as all biographies claim. Alfred Dallemann was the son of François Joseph Dallemann, a wig maker, and Sophie Isabelle Joseph Ornès. From 1840, Alfred Dallemann published archaeological articles on Flanders in Le Vieux du Nord. A disciple of Proudhon, he became his secretary and launched into journalism. A convinced Republican, Alfred Dallemann collaborated with Les Poubelles, I don't know how to say people in French, in 1848. In 1850, Alfred Dallemann became editor-in-chief of La Voix du Peuple, then joined La Presse at the beginning of the Second Empire. There, Alfred Dallemann dealt with economic and financial issues. In the 1857 elections, Alfred Dallemann was elected in the second round, deputy for the 7th constituency of the Seine. A member of the group of five Republican deputies who agreed to take the oath. Alfred Dallemann was their specialist in economic and financial issues. Alfred Dallemann proved to be very active, speaking on many occasions and constantly calling for the abolition of the General Security Act, as the July 12, 1860. He is in favor of free trade and Franco-English bilateral treaty, Again, I'm translating this from the French Wikipedia. Re-elected in 1863, Alfred Dallemann followed Olivier's evolution by moving closer to the government. Alfred Dallemann thus took note of the liberal evolution of the regime. On March 3, 1864, Alfred Derrymon went to the Tuileries concert at the invitation of the emperor. Alfred Derrymon appeared in his breeches at the Mondays of Empress Eugenie, I don't know if I'm saying that right, and the left no longer invited Alfred Derrymon to its meetings. In the legislative body, Alfred Derrymon called for trade union chambers and cooperatives for workers. Considered a specialist on the subject, Alfred Derrymon joined the Society for the Propagation of Vocational Education in July 1864. Having become secretary of the legislative body in 1865, he was rapporteur of the law on checks, which he was very much in favor of and which was adopted. Alfred Derrymon voted for the address and received the Legion of Honor on August 30th, 1865. Abandoned by the opposition, Derrymon did not stand again in 1869 and was appointed consul in Rotterdam after the elections, but did not occupy this post. Alfred Derrymon unsuccessfully sought a position as state councillor. Alfred Derrymon felt forgotten and complained directly to Napoleon III. On December 14, 1869, Alfred Derrymon ended up being appointed Special Commissioner of the Higher Council of Commerce, Agriculture and Industry for the monetary question. Alfred Derrymon collaborated with La Revue Contemporaine after September 4, 1870. Alfred Derrymon wrote several articles for Le Figaro and became a reader at the publisher Dentu, where Alfred Derrymon published numerous works on the political life of the Second Empire and his activities during this period. He spent the rest of his life in Galdignani retirement home and died in the deepest destitution on the 1st of October 1902 at 85 years old. Alfred Derrymon published several works, including Through a Revolution, which recounts Alfred Derrymon's relations with Proudhon during the Revolution of 1848. So, back to the text. Moreover, the body of the Grundrisse begins with an extensive critique of Alfred Derrymon, a follower of Proudhon, who wanted to supplant money with time chits issued on the basis of how many hours an individual actually worked. If price were just a label for the labor embodied in a good, the proposal should work. But Marx links the problem with time chits to a misunderstanding of the price form. Quote, "The first fundamental illusion of the time chitters consists therein that by annulling the nominal diversity between real value and market value, between exchange value and price, this expresses the value in the labor time itself instead of a specific objectification of labor time, say gold and silver. The time chitters also put aside the actual difference and contradiction between price and value," end quote. Marx. Along with Proudhon, Alfred Derrymon takes the nominalist view of money, claiming that as the mediator of commodity exchange, money is a troublesome but removable contrivance rather than a logically necessary third party. Such theorists resent the interference of money at the same time as they champion commodity production and the egalitarianism found in the exchange of equal values. Marx takes to mean that the utopian or, quote, bourgeois socialists want to have their cake and eat it too, or as Marx put it with respect to John Gray, quote, "The products are supposed to be produced as commodities, but are not to be exchanged as commodities," end quote. Marx. These, quote, unscientific socialists, end quote, simply fail to grasp the logical relations linking the categories of commodity, value, and price. According to Wikipedia, John Gray lived from 1799 to 1883 and was a British newspaper proprietor and economist. John Gray first published a work, Lecture on Human Happiness, John Gray's first published work, A Lecture on Human Happiness, was broadly supportive of the ideas of Robert Owen, although John Gray would later criticize Owen's communitarianism. John Gray's critique of laissez-faire capitalism is usually associated with the school of Ricardian socialism, and John Gray was one of the earliest writers to advocate a centrally planned economy. Gray was born in Derbyshire and attended Repton School. John Gray was, by his own admission, a poor scholar who spent most of his time fishing, climbing trees, and playing marbles, and his final school report described him as, quote, possessing abilities, rising barely to mediocrity, end quote. John Gray left school at 14 and was employed by a wholesale manufacturing company in Cheapside, London. John Gray's job took him all over London, and the conditions that he witnessed convinced him that there was something wrong with the way that the economy functioned. John Gray later wrote, quote, I saw clearly that goods of every description are made either because they are ordered or because there is every prospect of their being so, and continued reflection satisfied me that this state of things ought to be reversed, that production, instead of being the effect of demand, ought to be the cause of demand. End quote. John Gray. After reading Smith's The Wealth of Nations, Gray wrote a manuscript called The National Commercial System, but friends persuaded Gray that it was poorly written and should not be published. At his brother's suggestion, John Gray started to read the writings of Robert Owen and soon realized that their views coincided. John Gray's revised thoughts were published in a pamphlet, A Lecture on Human Happiness. John Gray's lecture on human happiness contained some of the key tenets of both Owenism and what would later be called Ricardian socialism. John Gray's starting point was that humans are by nature social creatures, imbued with a desire for happiness. This desire can only be achieved when basic human wants are satisfied, and the fact that there is so much misery in the world proves that society is constructed upon the wrong principles. John Gray said that the entire wealth of the country was created by productive labor, which John Gray defined as, quote, laboring people employed in agriculture, mines, and minerals, artisans, handicrafts, mechanics, and laborers employed in manufactories, buildings, and works of every kind, end quote. John Gray. John Gray regarded everyone else as unproductive and therefore a direct tax on the productive classes. Furthermore, those who failed to give an equivalent for what they consumed were, he said, useless members of society. Using statistical evidence from Patrick Calhoun's Treatise on Wealth, Power and Resources of the British Empire, published in 1814, Gray analyzed how much every section of society contributed to the wealth of the nation and compared that to their actual income. To this, he added comments based primarily on his own moral judgments about the utilitarian value of each occupation to society as a whole. For example, John Gray dismissed the labor of servants as useless because the only beneficiaries of their work were their wealthy employers. The productive classes, Gray calculated, only received about 1/5 of the wealth that they created. The other 4/5 being taken from them by rent, interest, and capitalist profits. The root cause of this, he argued, was underconsumption. John Gray said that production should only be limited by either the satisfaction of all the wants of society or the exhaustion of its productive powers. Capitalist competition, however, introduced an artificial barrier to production, limiting it to, quote, demand, which was measured by the amount that could be sold at a profit. This led to job losses and wage cuts, so that laborers could not afford to buy the goods that they needed. Although John Gray dissociated himself from Owenite views on the formation of character, John Gray praised Owen's economic ideas, which John Gray said would abolish the artificial limit of production and give producers the wealth they create. John Gray supported the formation of cooperative communities where competitive exchange would not exist, and added an annex to his pamphlet containing the Articles of Association for the formation of such a community, drawn up by the London Cooperative Society. Due to production problems, the pamphlet had only limited distribution in Britain, but sold well in the United States and has been credited with influencing the development of socialist ideas in both countries. In 1825, John Gray moved to Edinburgh, Scotland, intending to join the community which was being set up by Abram Combe at Orbiston near Motherwell. Gray bought shares in the Orbiston Company, but following a brief visit to Orbiston, during which he had been alarmed by what he saw as a lack of management planning, John Gray decided against becoming a community member. In his pamphlet, A Word of Advice to the Orbistonians, published in 1826, John Gray warned that too many activities were being undertaken by people who lacked the necessary skills to carry them out, and that unless a skilled workforce and a professional manager were brought in, the project was doomed to failure. These criticisms, however, would not prevent Gray from writing a generous tribute to Combe after his early death. John Gray remained in Edinburgh, where he founded a free newspaper consisting entirely of advertisements, the Edinburgh and Leith Advertiser. Unfortunately for John Gray, the publication of advertisements soon became liable to stamp duty, so in partnership with his brother James, he converted the Advertiser into a regular newspaper with James as editor. This survived for 53 editions, after which brothers reverted to the purely advertising format with the Edinburgh, Leith, Glasgow, and North British Advertiser, and later the North British Advertiser. Gray went through difficult times over the next few years. In 1829, Gray suffered a mental breakdown from which his brother helped to nurse him back to health. In 1830, John Gray was briefly imprisoned for debt, following the failure of his project to establish a printer's hall where businesses could share modern machinery, and in 1831 his wife Caroline died. The North British Advertiser, however, would eventually make Gray a very wealthy man. Gray's next publication, The Social System, a treatise on the principle of exchange, appeared in 1831. Although Gray wrote that his views were, quote, substantially the same as those which I entertained many years ago, end quote, his criticisms of Owenism were more sharply expressed than his lecture on human happiness. Gray strongly objected to Owen's policy of equal distribution of property and dismissed as delusional the Owenite belief that a person's character had to be improved before they could become wealthy. Although he still believed in the concept of cooperation, it was not in any communitarian sense, but, quote, merely a thoroughly organized plan of producing, exchanging, and distributing the wealth of this country, end quote. John Gray. The pamphlet Social System was one of the earliest attempts to articulate a centrally planned economy. Gray's plan involved the creation of a National Chamber of Commerce, NCC, which would exercise complete control over the cultivation, manufacture, and distribution of food and all other goods. Produce and manufactured goods would be deposited in national warehouses for onward supply to retail shops, and the warehouse and shop managers would all be employed by the NCC. Wages and prices would be determined by the NCC, which would also be able to increase or limit production of any items depending on whether there were too many or too few of them being produced. The system was voluntary, and owners of land and capital who opted in would be compensated by a fixed annual fee. There would be no competition over the employment of capital by Gray's system, allowed for laborers who produced more or better quality goods to be paid extra. The value of goods would be based on labor time, given a financial value by averaging wages paid over the last few years, plus costs of materials and overheads such as rent, interest, salaries of NCC managers, replacement of stock, and other capital investment. John Gray also proposed the establishment of a national bank to regulate the supply and value of money. John Gray argued that gold was inappropriate as a medium of exchange, as it was a commodity governed by a competitive system and therefore subject to price fluctuation. Gray had the same objection to paper banknotes, which Gray said were issued on the basis of securities whose value exceeded that of the notes themselves. It was fear of money losing its value that caused manufacturers to limit production to the quantity that could be sold at a profit, and the only way to rectify this, according to John Gray, was for money to have no intrinsic value of its own. It should merely represent the value that its holder had either contributed to the national stock or acquired from the person who contributed it. The National Bank would ensure that production became the source of demand by increasing the money supply as production increased and decreasing it when produce was redemanded or consumed. Not many copies of John Gray's The Social System were sold, and John Gray published nothing more on the subject for 11 years. During this time, John Gray married Jane Rennie, and they had at least 2 children, one of whom died in infancy. John Gray remained in partnership with his brother James, and their newspaper, the North British Advertiser, flourished, eventually achieving a circulation of 19,000. By the early 1840s, he was wealthy enough to live at Faldonside
a large country house near Galashiels. Gray's subsequent writings were primarily concerned with elaborating his views on the defects of the existing monetary system and the importance of production becoming the cause of demand. The aims and basic mechanisms of his social system were still intact, but he allowed greater scope for market forces. In a piece titled "Efficient Remedy for the Distress of Nations," published in 1842, production would still be controlled by the NCC, but retail distribution would be in private hands and prices would be regulated only by competition amongst the vendors. In 1848, John Gray gave a series of lectures to the Edinburgh Philosophical Institution, which are published as lectures on the nature and use of money. In this book, he still claimed that he had not changed his opinions, but was now simplifying his plan in order to make it easier to introduce. In doing so, he showed more faith in laissez-faire economics that had previously. His system would now be further deregulated to allow manufacturers to determine the amount of profit they could build into their selling price, limited only by competition. The only regulation involved in fixing the price would be a minimum wage. In an attempt to give maximum publicity to his ideas, Gray paid for 1,200 copies of lectures to be distributed to members of Parliament, the House of Lords, newspaper editors, and other influential people. He sent some copies to France, offering one to the provisional government of the French Second Republic and others to the United States. Lectures was Gray's last known work. Between 1854 and 1866, John Gray owned an estate of 26 acres at Bonnelly Tower near Edinburgh before retiring to Upper Norwood in Surrey, at that time a very wealthy area, where he died in 1883. In his will, John Gray's estate was valued at over £14,000, the equivalent of over £1.6 million, or $2.1 million US in 2018. Gray's theories were critiqued by Karl Marx in his A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, published in 1859. Marx argued that Gray's analysis of money and commodities was incomplete, and that he had not understood that money represents a definite system of relations of production. This error had led John Gray to the utopian view that capitalism could be eliminated by equalizing exchange. Several writers have echoed Marx's criticisms, both of Gray and of the Ricardian socialists in general. Some other writers, however, have argued that Gray, at least in his earlier works, and other Ricardian socialists provided some of the foundations that Marx would build upon. Okay, so thank you for letting me look at some of those. Look at this very extended Wikipedia on John Gray, but he's someone whose name I've seen a million times, and I just kind of like, oh, that's just a name. I should probably know something about the guy if I want to be knowledgeable about the history of socialism and Marx's critique of political economy. Anyway, back to the text. The logic of capital. The logic of simple commodity circulation, which we have just examined, conforms to Hegel's logic of essence, as well as to Marx's. I now argue that Marx deliberately presents capital in terms that evoke his early treatment of Hegel's logic of the concept, and thereby reinforce his early criticism that Hegel's logic of the concept is a, quote, wooden sword, a defective reconciliation that leaves the opposed elements standing in their opposition to one another. Footnote: as Jean A. Schuller, Tony Smith, and Gert Reuten have pointed out to me, there are very good reasons for doubting that Hegel's logic of the concept actually applies to capital. I am very suspicious about this myself, but here I restrict myself to what Marx saw himself doing with Hegel and capital, not whether he was justified. Back to the text, or end footnote. When Marx speaks of value in the sphere of simple circulation, Marx speaks of social, quote, substance. But Marx describes capital with the phrases, quote, automatic subject, quote, here value becomes the subject of a process, end quote. Quote, the encompassing subject of such a process, end quote. And, quote, itself self-moving substance, end quote. In the concept of capital, substance reveals itself as subject, albeit an automatic subject. Marx here recalls Hegel's criticism of Spinoza for conceiving of the absolute as a substance but not subject. A comparison of the following two passages. The first, Hegel's description of the infinite as conceived on the logical level of the concept. The second, a description of capital from Marx's text, bringing out what was in Marx's mind in identifying the logic of capital, which with Hegel's logic of the concept. Quote, only the veritable infinite, only the veritable infinite, which posits itself as finite, reaches at the same time beyond the veritable infinite self as an other and remains therein, because the veritable infinite is the veritable infinite's other, in unity with itself. End quote. Hegel. Quote, its, bracket, monies, end bracket, going into circulation must itself be a moment of money's remaining within itself, and money's remaining with itself must be a going into circulation, end quote. Marx. Marx underlines the identification of simple circulation with Hegelian essence logic and capital circulation with the Hegelian logic of the concept as he conceived of it by appealing to the association of Judaism with the former and Christianity with the latter. At the same time, these associations bring home the point that for Marx, the Hegelian concept is just as, quote, religious as his essence. The association of capital with Christianity could not be more explicit than in this passage. Quote, it, bracket, value, end bracket, differentiates value self as original value from value self as surplus value, as God the Father from himself as God the Son, and both of the same age and constitute in fact only one person, for only through the surplus value of £10 sterling do the advanced £100 sterling become capital. And as soon as the £100 sterling have become capital, as soon as the Son is created and through the Son the Father, their difference disappears again, and both are one, £110 sterling, end quote. Marx. It says 101 bracket sick, so that means Marx made a typo, but it's supposed to be 110. Just before this passage, Marx contrasts the logics of simple circulation and capital circulation with those of Judaism and Christianity, respectively. Quote, the capitalist knows that all commodities, no matter how raggedly they look, or how bad those commodities smell, are in faith and in truth money, innerly circumcised Jews, and moreover wonder-working means to make money out of money. End quote. Marx. The fact that in Capital, Marx endeavors to associate the logic of capital with Hegel's concept and with Christianity demonstrates the continuing relevance of his early writings to his mature critique of political economy, in particular to his theory of capital. Recall Marx wrote that Hegel's logic is the necessary result of his whole philosophy being governed by abstract thought. Logic is the necessary form of appearance of abstract thinking, just as money is the necessary form of appearance of the abstract labor performed under the conditions of capitalism. Quote, logic is the money of spirit, end quote. Following the consequences of these associations sheds light on the significance of the dialectical logic of the value form for Marx's theory of capital. As he criticized Hegel in the last of the Paris manuscripts, Marx simultaneously explored the logic of value, including, of course, the logic of capital. As we saw earlier, Marx associated the logical ideas externalization in nature and spirit with the valorization process whereby money is transformed into capital. Notice now that in both cases the cycle begins and ends not with abstract thought or with value, but with their necessary forms of appearance, logic, and money. What this tells us is that the dialectical logics of essence and of value are already integrated into Marx's conception of Hegel's philosophy of spirit and his theory of capital. As value striving to expand that value's self in an endless spiral, capital is not money, nor any production process, nor any commodity. But our exploration of Marx's theory of value has taught us, what our exploration of Marx's theory of value has taught us is that as a category of value, capital is itself necessarily non-apparent, non-observable, and capital must appear as something other than itself. What distinguishes capital from the logic of value at the level of simple commodity circulation is that, though it is identical to none of them, capital recognizes capital's self in money, in production, in commodities. The formula money, commodity, money prime, or more fully, money, commodity, production, commodity with added value, money with added value, is the necessary form of capital's appearance. Footnote: this is a natural extension of the connections I pointed out regarding Marx's Parisian critique of Hegel, but it was Martha Campbell who helped me see that. End footnote. The embedding of the dialectical logic of the value form in Marx's introduction of the concept of capital implies that his theory of capital is at least as profoundly post-Ricardian as is his theory of value. Unawares of the significance of social form, the Ricardian theory of capital depicts capitalist production as, quote, the production of commodities by means of commodities, end quote. That's I don't know if it's a subtitle or if just the title is such of Sraffa's book. Or commodity production commodity prime. The givens in Marx's theory of capitalist production are not the physical quantities of the technical conditions of production in the real wages, as they are in Ricardian theory, but sums of money, value's necessary form of appearance, which are invested as capital. Thus, the logical lessons Marx learned from Hegel are central to his surpassing of Ricardo's theory of value, whether at the level of simple circulation or of capital. The end. Thank you so much for listening.